and welcome to this episode of PsychMedia. Now, today we're going to be discussing Winnie the Pooh fan theory, what behavior defines mental illness, and when clinical thresholds apply in diagnostic criteria. Right, so a little clarification here. I'm using the Disney adaptations of the characters from the classic animations of the 1960s and 70s, as they're the versions of the characters people are most immediately familiar with. While I'm going to eventually do an episode on fan theory, I thought this was the perfect jumping off point to examine how people think about characters and how they relate to them. It's also handy to discuss exactly what we mean when we talk about mental illness. The popular fan theory that each character from the Hundred Acre Wood exemplifies a specific mental illness is not new. It stems from a tongue-in-cheek article published in the Journal of the Canadian Medical Association in 2000, written by actual clinicians. While the article is satire meant to demonstrate that anyone could suffer with mental illness in an attempt to reduce stigma, the theory's popularity almost 20 years on says a lot about how we think about mental illness. In popular culture, we assign specific traits and behaviors to specific mental illnesses, but at what level or clinical threshold does a quirk become a disorder? I mean, who hasn't heard someone say, "I need to organize everything. I'm so OCD." Historically, mental health professionals have used criteria to diagnose when behavior becomes indicative of disorder. Now, these criteria have changed a lot over the decades as our understanding of mental illness has changed, and they're not a perfect system. In fact, both the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the International Classification of Diseases have radically changed the criteria between editions. So, if the criteria system is okay, not perfect, what's our actual threshold for mental illness? That would be distress. Distress defines when behavior becomes symptoms, when it becomes suffering, when normal brain functioning for the individual or even normal day-to-day functioning becomes impaired. That's distress made manifest. That point of impairment is our clinical threshold. Someone hearing the comforting voices of angels is experiencing audio hallucinations, but without distress, while someone hearing paranoid whispers criticizing them experiences distress. In psychopathology, that difference is very important. So mental illness is more than traits and behavior. It's specific criteria about that behavior, but even more importantly, it's about the individual in distress. A good clinician takes everything about the individual into account when they make their diagnosis. So back to Winnie the Pooh. Let's examine each character's diagnosis and then deconstruct their behavior, considering the personal and social context that surrounds it. You know, like how a clinician would actually evaluate a patient. First up, that silly old bear Pooh himself. Now, he's described as suffering from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and an eating disorder. He can't focus and he obsesses over honey, calling himself a bear of very little brains. However, the nature of a bear is to eat in preparation for hibernation. Also, Pooh comes up with creative schemes to get honey, an example of food-driven behavior that also provides cognitive stimulus and physical exercise. Piglet's stuttering and timid nature seem to be a clear indicator of generalized anxiety disorder, potentially stemming from trauma. He worries constantly for himself and his friends, admitting that it's hard to be brave when you're such a small animal. But Piglet is young. Adult pigs have little predator fear in the wild, so a piglet alone would be in danger without the protection of others. Piglet's altruism may be an adaptive function to maintain the social bonds and connections to others that mean his survival. Tigger's reckless behavior has also been called ADHD with a bit of impulse control disorder. He's a thrill seeker who prioritizes fun and adventure over everything else, oftentimes to the detriment of himself and his friends. However, tigers are apex predators that play and relax when not hunting. Tigger may seek stimulation from his environment because of a low level of inborn stimulus, making him a classic extrovert. Rabbit stands diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder for his high level of order and perfectionism. He's often very frustrated with his friends when they mess up his carefully made plans or otherwise complicate his life. But Rabbit is a farmer, and when one is self-sufficient, a good harvest is the line between living and starvation. He lives alone, outside the protective society of a rabbit warren, meaning his survival has a very slim margin of error. Wise Old Al is said to be dyslexic and suffer from short-term memory loss. He prides himself on being educated and loves to share his knowledge, but he's equally passionate about not admitting when he's wrong or if he doesn't know the answer. It's implied that Owl's literacy is self-taught, so gaps in grammar, spelling, and syntax are to be expected. Avian predators' brains are streamlined for prey drive, so repurposing for knowledge retention may have sacrificed some of Owl's short-term memory functions. Eeyore is obviously depressed, as is clear from his mood and pessimistic outlook. Described as gloomy, he's plagued by bad luck and general melancholy, which he's dourly upfront about. Of all the characters, he comes the closest to mental illness. But donkeys are naturally solitary creatures in the wild. Humans have selectively bred them for work and labor for at least 5,000 years, if not more. Eeyore is a lone beast of burden with no job to do, creating a hole in his life he might not know how to fill. Kanga is diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, manifesting as unwarranted overprotection of her son Rue. Her worries for his safety may also be blamed on the anxiety of being a single mother. But one of the strongest biological drives is the protection of young, which can be seen in a myriad of species. Kanga has no anxiety over socialization with her friends, and in many species who rear their young, the father plays little part. Young Rue's behavior is said to be descriptive of autism spectrum disorder, for his fearlessness and obsession with his mother's pouch. He lacks awareness of danger and impulsively follows Tigger into mischief. However, Rue clearly possesses theory of mind and understands the cultural norms of the Hundred-Acre Wood. Growing children vacillate between independence behavior and parental protection, and as marsupials, young kangaroos undergo months of development in their mother's pouch. That leaves us with Christopher Robin, self-secluding with toys over human friends and experiencing schizophrenic hallucinations and delusions. Surely he must be significantly mentally ill to spend his time in a fantasy world, right? Let's go back to what we said about distress as a factor. Even if Christopher Robin is delusional, he's not experiencing distress. In fact, these adventures are beneficial and empowering. A good therapist might even say they're therapeutic. If we're considering distress as our clinical threshold instead of straight diagnostic criteria, Rabbit and Piglet would come the closest under generalized anxiety disorder, as Rabbit doesn't manifest any of the compulsive, repetitive behaviors of OCD. Then there's Eeyore. Does his depression cause him distress? He certainly has a chronic low mood and flat affect, but is that part of his personality or a sign of disorder? A good clinician would ask him, and then base his diagnosis off that answer. Okay, real talk. Conversations between the clinician and patient help define distress and contributing behavior. That's the reason why diagnosis without psychological evaluation is very problematic. To know, you have to ask, and who better to ask than the individual? So what about you? Do you identify with any of the characters in the Hundred-Acre Wood? Have you ever seen mental illness or a diagnosis used inappropriately in media? Let me know in the comments. So Lauren Fox, the cartoon physicist, told me about the 1997 film Pooh's Grand Adventure, The Search for Christopher Robin. It's a kind of darker exploration of the manifest traits of each character. Give it a watch for a real example of their personal growth. Well, that's been this episode of PsychMedia. Please like and subscribe if you feel moved to do so. And if you did want to support myself or the show, there's a link to my Patreon in the description box below. Bye now. Thank you to the following patrons, with an especial thank you to Gomer, Nate Watson, and Ed Palnick.